Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to talk about the state of Holy Paladin for 10.2. As with 1 week in the books, we've been able to play out Holy Paladin in some of the dungeons and see how it's performing so far in raids, and it is looking incredibly powerful. While 10.1.5 revamped the spec, and ever since, they've kind of had this like death by 1,000 cuts of little nerfs, little nerfs, little nerfs. 10.2 is kind of a fresh start for them, and there's some very notable buffs coming into the spec and changes to how it's working. So we're going to start off with what I like, some of the things that I don't like, and some of the downsides and upsides for raids and Mythic Plus. Starting off, of course, is going to be the good that the set bonuses are freaking sweet for Holy Paladins. Particularly the two-piece, it's like a holy reverb, that when your Glimmer expires or is refreshed, this is very important, it will then put a buff or debuff on the enemy, and it'll cause them to like reverberate damage and healing. So the important part of this is you have to like double tap your Holy Shock into the target to set the reverb onto them. You have to like Holy Shock and applies Glimmer, Holy Shock again, and then it refreshes the Glimmer and applies that reverberation. Pulsing the damage, pulsing the healing, whatever it might be. This freaking sweet ability does tons of damage and healing, feels very noticeable, and also is really good because it's all about control. You'll notice quite a bit in raid encounters, for example, if you're reverbing targets that are out in Egypt and just running off along on their own, versus being able to put a lot of reverbs onto melee specs and melee characters. And so it adds a nice little bit of depth to Holy Paladin, which kind of felt like it was lacking a little bit with 10.1.5. While there's obviously a lot of good things you can min-max with the spec since it has been revamped, it's pretty straightforward that you want to be shocking a whole bunch and using it. Now, having to think a little bit more about trying to place those reverberations or even being able to stack them, as they can stack up to 3 times, feels very valuable. And to really help you do that, Daybreak gets some cooldown reduction with your 4-piece, which on its own isn't a huge deal. But again, you have to keep in mind, activating Daybreak more frequently gives you those extra Holy Shocks, where you're getting 3 back-to-back Holy Shocks onto that target. And so you can really quickly build up 2 stacks of reverberation onto each ally with those Holy Shocks after you hit the Daybreak, which has really good synergy that you have access to together. They also made some changes to spot healing, noticeably Flash of Light and Holy Light getting buffed to be able to increase their spot healing. This is also going to be very noticeable because you are losing out on your Holy Prism and Light's Hammer set bonus. And usually in dungeons in particular, you'd be using that Light's Prism to be able to crank really strong single target healing or just, you know, decent group healing. Now when you lose that, very, very noticeable, but the upside is that they're also making your casted heals a little bit stronger. Now, you don't really want to be casting a lot, obviously, as a Holy Paladin, but from my experience so far, Flash of Light hits pretty good, and when you have Infusion of Light up, it costs near nothing to be able to utilize, meaning that while it's frustrating casting spells and whatever as a Holy Pally, you can really quickly just get a Flash of Light off, consume that infusion, and then move on to whatever it is that you're doing. And that actually feels pretty good as a like successor really to Holy Prism's spot heal potential. It's kind of a decent little change. I will say there is some general bads that are going on with Holy Paladin that still sort of exist. While it's not the end of the world, your spenders just feel bad. Word of Glory and Light of Dawn have a mana cost attached to them, they have a resource cost attached to them, and even with all of that, they just don't really feel like they heal that much. One of the biggest things in a raiding environment is that there's many different times where Holy Paladins are overcapping their holy power and just hitting more Holy Shocks because Holy Shock is so strong. Now, it's fun gameplay to be able to just blast all your Holy Shocks and play off of the new tier set bonus and Glimmer. I like that. But then we also have these resources that feel bad to spend. And there's actually a great article by Clarius, the Holy Pally guide writer for Wowhead, linked in the description down below if you want to give it a read, where he's talking about, hey, we might just wait for our spender buffs before we actually spend our holy power in a raid environment because we're going to be glutted with so many Holy Shocks that it's just a higher priority to use this ability. And that is just, while it's true, it's just a bonkers concept to me that we brought holy power back and then it just feels bad to actually utilize it. Now, things like Shield of the Righteous, of course, have gotten their nerfs, and their damage, of course, has been nerfed for Paladin in the past, but at least you sort of had something to dump your holy power onto. But now that Shield of the Righteous is on the GCD, there's the opportunity cost of casting the Shield of the Righteous or just hitting more Holy Shocks and hitting more healing spells. And so that, I think, is quite a noticeable downside for Holy Paladin at the moment, is Clarius even talks about this great sort of holy trinity of Infusion of Light, Holy Shock, and of course your spenders. And if you get into this world where some of them are much stronger than others, you're kind of ignoring a piece of the spec. It feels just sort of counterintuitive to gameplay, to that you're building up these resources, but they feel very weak and you're only utilizing them in certain situations or downtime, instead of having it complement the rest of your spec. He even goes as far as to say that they could do away with Holy Power entirely, and it would actually still be a good and fun playstyle, and I think he's right. I'd actually be kind of curious to see if Word of Glory and Light of Dawn and Shield of the Righteous could be like 2 charges, but they share the charges together, and you can kind of pick and choose when you want to use them, and that way you weave them in from time to time, but you can also choose to pool them for specific damage events, or however you'd like to use them. I think that'd be pretty cool. Unfortunately, I don't really think it's something they could do this expansion, so you're sort of stuck in this position where you have certain abilities that sort of just feel like, I don't know, a rotten branch on the tree, really. That, yeah, sometimes you use them, but it doesn't really have as much of an impact as you would really hope for. Some potential solutions, like we mentioned before, would also be removing Holy Power entirely, but what about just being able to spend more of your Holy Power in an instant? If you're at this point where you're generating, 3 Holy Power at a time with your Daybreak, for example, or the after effects of Daybreak, why can't you just be in a position where you could spend Holy Power in greater amounts? Back in the day, I believe this was like Mr. Pandaria, you could kind of choose whichever amount of Holy Power to spend your abilities on, and it was like really popular to spend your single target Eternal Flame, which is like this long hot, on like 1 Holy Power Eternal Flames on a variety of targets. Why don't they just let you spend 5 Holy Power for this maxed out Word of Glory or Light of Dawn or something along those lines? Or I believe it was like Divine Insight, some like old ability where you would spend your Holy Power to regain mana. And so you're losing out on the potential of healing, but then you're getting mana instead. Like something along those lines to make it so that Holy Power actually feels like it can have good value when it comes to a raiding environment. Because yeah, in a dungeon environment, hey, you're bound to have downtime. Blasting on damage. Feels good, and you're off to the races, right? Another downside of Paladin is that there's not a lot of like flexibility with the talent tree, and I think that really is noticeable with raiding, in that you're running mostly the same talents in the spec tree for raids and Mythic Plus, with a couple little adjustments here and there. You're always running Tears, you're always running Daybreak, there's some adjustments between like Reclamation and Barrier of Faith, but overall, it's the same kind of idea that you have for it. And when they want to nerf Holy Paladin's 5-man output, then they're also nerfing Holy Paladin's raid output, where they went from one of the best, highest output healers in raid, and as they started nerfing it primarily because of dungeon output, it brought them to like middle of the pack, almost like mediocre healing, and that was just about it. It was like, oh, okay, well, I'm getting nerfed in a raiding environment because I'm overperforming in a 5-man, and there's not really any sort of independent variable to be able to tune around those things. And so it's always something that's kind of in the back of my mind going forward, is that, Disc Priest just did get an independent variable with their atonement, and part of with Holy Paladin is that the talents don't have a lot of friction to them, so you kind of just take all of those big cooldowns together, and they also get nerfed for both types of content together. So far in a Mythic Plus environment, I've done most of the dungeons that have been available for testing. They have not had Throne of the Tides or Everbloom at the time of this recording to test just yet, but there's a lot of kicks in the Season 3 dungeons, and Holy Paladin really shines for that, of course. There's also a good amount of effects that sort of like punish melee players, and so while that can be frustrating for bringing other healers, a Paladin that has Blessing of Protection, Divine Shield, just good armor in general is always going to feel very, very stout against a lot of those effects. And a lot of Holy Paladin's kit to begin with, you could do outside of melee. So getting pushed out of melee and then just kind of hitting your shocks or throwing your judgment from a distance isn't nearly as bad as playing like a Mistweaver monk and suddenly you can't spin anymore, and then you have to sit outside and hardcast and burn your mana bar down instead. So there's a very big difference there for the melee healers, and Paladin is very well suited towards that. Like I said before, Prism set bonus getting nerfed is very noticeable since you're not having as good of spot healing, but I think Flash of Light kind of fills in that role pretty decently, and just being able to get a really quick cast that's very cheap Also is going to make it easier on your mana, especially if you're using it frequently enough in between your Holy Shock cooldowns. The mana nerfs were a little noticeable, and I think Paladin is getting into a point where you will have to maybe lag behind the group a little bit, get a sip in, get a little bit of water, and then catch up to the team. But I don't think it's so bad that you're going to be like holding up the entire group. Personally, I'm really not a fan whatsoever of when Paladin feels like it's bad mana-wise, because Paladin doesn't really have an ability kind of like Prayer of Healing or like Chain Heal where you just spam it night and day and, you know, you should naturally if you're abusing it or overusing it. Paladin's never really had something like that except for like, I don't know, Holy Radiance and like, I want to say Mist of Pandaria or Warlords. Actually, I think they got rid of it in Warlords of Draenor. So they don't really have this like hardcore mana dump ability. And there's been times over the years that Holy Paladin has like itself by hitting Crusader Strike too much, which feels inane to me. So when it comes to mana nerfs, I feel like it's one of those healers that should never really struggle, or if they are going to add high cost to it, they might as well be adding Holy Power mana regen kind of mechanics into it as well. So far, it looked like it held up pretty well in raid testing for its mana consumption, and it was noticeable that there was a little like almost extra tug on my mana since they nerfed down the Holy Shock and Crusader Strike mana cost talent called Reclamation. They nerfed that a little bit, and they nerfed some of the Daybreak mana regen that's coming into it. But the spec still felt mostly the same when I was going through those dungeons. It's just the added value of an insanely good dispel profile. There's a lot of poisons and diseases in these new dungeons. Notably, Darkheart Thicket has a slew of poisons. There's a good amount of disease in Waycrest Manor, for example. Paladin being able to do both, really, really insane. Lots of kicks, always going to favor the Paladins. And dungeons like a Taldazar, they are going to need some work. Some of these dungeons where they're killing snap spots, well, that just means that your healer, if you're a melee healer, needs to walk into the Saurid pack, the little raptor pack, and just get eaten alive. And if you're doing that as a Mistweaver, as I've experienced, you will get eaten alive. But when you have way more damage reduction for physical attacks, as a Paladin, you're going to be doing quite well. So that is a very major advantage that Paladin's going to have going into it. And unless something else is going to be changing, I do think Paladin is going to be crushing it in the next season of Mythic Plus. But of course, we still have a lot of time till 10.2 launches, and I'll be keeping all kinds of updates going. So make sure, of course, you are subscribing to the channel if you have not already. And if you'd like to support the content further, be sure to check out our Patreon as well. Any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. But thank you so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.